Let children read whatever they want, and then talk about it with them. Judy Blume. For this episode of It's Time for Science, we went to the world-renowned San Diego Comic-Con. We looked high and low for folks to talk about the importance of science education and graphic novels. And it turns out it was super easy to find people on the same page. I have moderated dozens of panels over the past 8 years or so on the topic of comics in the classroom and what an incredibly valuable tool they are for teachers. There are so many resources out there for teachers to integrate them into their classrooms, lesson plans, activities, reading lists. It's a personal topic for me because I have seen firsthand the passion of the educators who have embraced comics and graphic novels and the amazing effect they have on all kids. To start us off before we head to San Diego Comic-Con is my interview with Tracy Edmunds. Tracy is a teacher, educational consultant, curriculum developer, editor, and writer with over 14 years' experience as an elementary teacher, in addition to authoring 25 resource books for educators. Tracy has an amazing and invaluable list of science comics and recommendations on her site, so check out the links in the description. I always say when you want the facts about something, you go to the experts, and in my mind, there is no better expert than Tracy Edmunds. Tracy Edmunds spent 12 years as a classroom teacher and is still in the classroom, and many years since doing project management, curriculum development, writing, and editing. She's the former vice president of K-12 curriculum for the nonprofit organization Reading with Pictures, which is germane to our conversation. Tracy has authored over a dozen teacher resource books on STEM and science for elementary classrooms. She's edited professional books on arts integration, and specifically what we're here to talk about, Tracy has written and edited lessons and teacher guides on using comics in the classroom. I've done a few comic convention panels with Tracy, and every time I do, I learn something new. And we also really have excellent taste in 80s alternative music, so that we share that as well. So Tracy, welcome to It's Time for Science.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
I know, it's very exciting. This is a very personal thing for me because, as I said in my introduction earlier in this episode, is talking about how doing comics has been something in my entire life, but then suddenly being introduced to the idea of educational comics and how important they are and how it just was like this brilliant, aha moment for me of oh yeah, of course this makes sense. And so it's been really, really exciting to be involved in all these different panels, meeting people like you and talking to people. So it's become kind of a personal evangelism for me. So I want to talk to you specifically about in your life as a lifelong educator. Where was your sort of suddenly comics come into your purview as something you could use in the classroom? Did you have an aha moment, or how did it start for you?
Yeah, I really did. I mean, my kids had been reading comics when they were young and they loved them, and we went to the comic book store all the time, and I knew that they were getting a lot out of them. But I think the real aha moment for me came when I was teaching a reading intervention class for some kids. It turned out to be a class of all boys, and they were from maybe 2nd to 5th grade, and they were non-readers. They couldn't read at all. So we were doing some scripted programs. But I had a basket full of graphic novels that I would bring in that they could read during breaks. And there's, I can't remember the exact name of the book, but it was from a publisher that does specifically comic books and graphic novels for younger readers. I think it was called Jack and the Box. And it's a very early reader version of a comic with very few words in it. And one of my students was absolutely smitten with this book, and he wanted to be able to read it. He really wanted to be able to read the words in that book. So I specifically targeted that book with him. Once he learned enough, there wasn't very much vocabulary in the book. So once he learned the words that were in there, he would read the book out loud over and over to anyone that would listen, and he would point out what was happening in the panels and what happened and this happened and that happened. And he loved it so much, he wanted to write a letter to the creator, which I helped him do, and the creator wrote back. And when he held that letter to his chest like it was, the best thing that he'd ever received, clearly there was something going on there. So yeah, that was sort of the moment for me where it was like he never wanted to read a book, any early reader, any kind of book, except for this comic. So that sort of sort of got me going in that direction.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, I remember starting my original podcast because it's like, I like comics, but the more you get to know, I have a ton of author friends and everything, and that's like the moment, every single one of them is like, a kid writes to them and says, I read your book and I read it 1,000 times. I mean, there's nothing better than that. That's like the greatest thing in the world. And it's such an easy aha moment. You see it in their eyes. Oh, look at this book. I'm reading a book. And it's just, it's the most awesome thing. So people like you and I know the power of comics and graphic novels, but sadly, sort of the idea that comics are silly or frivolous is still out there. A long time from way back in the 1950s, all this stuff. But it's come a long way, obviously. I think whole generations have grown up with them and now they're teaching. So it's a lot better than it used to be. But there's probably still obstacles in the way, or if you're a teacher who wants to do this, what kind of evidence-based research is out there to present to your principal or to administrators or the district or whatever? How do you help them get to that point?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're still having this conversation, which we should be past it by now, but it happens all the time. I mean, I had school librarians tell the kids they couldn't check out graphic novels, that they had to get real books, that kind of thing. I would say first you need to know why comics are what we call, quote, real reading. And in some ways they are more complicated and complex reading than just reading text alone or reading a picture book. But as far as research, there's so much that I couldn't even sum up. It's really become a field of interest in science I've been doing this about 15 years. And when I started, there wasn't anything. There wasn't much at all. And now there's quite a bit. A lot of them are small scale, but there are research reviews out there and things. Off the top of my head, I can think of Jay Hostler, who, this is germane to this discussion about science. He's a scientist. He creates graphic novels about science. And he and colleagues did a study with their college courses where they used comics in some and not in others, and they've designed a research study around it. And not only did the comics help the students better understand the content and do better on the tests, but they improved attitudes towards science in general and toward the science topics that they were learning. So I would say it's a multi-fold reason, that comics are so effective in the classroom. It has to do with them being complex reading, which the reader has to work for. They have to make the meaning themselves by telling what happened in this panel, what happened to this panel, okay, what happened in between to get from here to there. There's a lot of, I really am pushing the idea of comics literacy. There's a lot in comics that you don't see in other forms of media. You won't see it in picture books or regular text or even in movies. You have captions and speech bubbles and gutters and panels and color, and all of these things create meaning. So when you're analyzing a comic book students, you really have to look at all of those things. But I think what really turns people's heads is when you start talking about the books that are out there that have been recognized. So you and I were talking about how Mouse by Art Spiegelman has won the Pulitzer Prize. And American Born Chinese by Gene Yang was the National Book Award finalist, and there is a television show that has just come out based on that work. And every year when the ALA awards come out, the Caldecott, the Newbery, and all this, there are always comics and graphic novels recognized in those awards. So if all else fails, trot some of those out for your administration and see, hey, if they're worth winning these awards, they're worth our kids reading them for sure.
I would also think that the famous Scott McCloud book on understanding comics and things like that, there's a lot of how to just learn the comics literacy aspect of it, because it's something we do naturally, but there is a ton of stuff going on. There could be time gaps between panels and things like that. There's all sorts of stuff happening. So if you want to update yourself on that, the Scott McCloud book is a great place to start.
Yeah, and I would say for younger students, because Scott McCloud is a little, it's.
Well, I meant for the teachers to learn about
it. For sure, to learn about it. But for kids and for if you work with younger readers, there's a series called Adventures in Cartooning from the Center for Cartoon Studies, and it's basically teaching kids how to make their own comics. But it's really great for helping them understand comics literacy. So
Sweet.
that's
We're going to come back to that because that's a big, important part of this, I think, as a teacher. But now, I mean, I think that it was great that comics got into, especially Mouse and things like that, and Raina Telgemeier's work, and there's a whole bunch of great ones for English literature, you know, people and kids learning about themselves. But we want to talk now about science comics, which is an interesting sort of subgenre. And it was something that kind of surprised even me. I always think of storytelling, you know, maybe a fantasy or a memoir or something like that. But there's so many amazing science comics out there now.
There really are.
That can really be used to help out. So, you know, it's science as a concept is perfect for graphic visualization. It's full of graphs and photos and diagrams. It's a visual medium. So how can a science teacher specifically work these things in, and what kind of graphic novels, maybe just a starting point? I know we'll talk a little bit later about some resources, but what kind of ones do you suggest, like right off the top?
Well, right off the top, there are so many free comics and comic strips online, webtoons, all those kind of things. I mean, we talk a lot about about having kids create comics, and a lot of times we'll hear, well, I don't know how to draw. XKCD is an online comic that has been going on forever. It's all based in STEM. It's very clever. It's for older or people with a very advanced knowledge of STEM. And it's stick figures. It's just stick figures, but he uses the medium of comics to make STEM hilarious and engaging, and I learn a lot.
I remember when I first saw that comic, I got super angry because I spent my entire life wanting to be a cartoonist and watching Looney Tunes and all this kind of stuff. And then I see this guy and I'm like, what the heck? And then I read it and I'm like, this is brilliant.
It's
oh my
so
God,
good.
it's so well written and it's perfect. I mean, the little stick figures are perfect. So yes, highly recommended, especially for older kids for that one.
Yeah. And so if you're just getting into it, you can start small like that. You can start with single panel comics. You can start with, you know, a strip that only has 3 panels in it. And that's a really good way to for a teacher to get involved in it, you know, at a kind of an easy entry level. But it's also good for working with kids. You know, it's good for helping them look at, well, what's the difference between panel 1, panel 2, and panel 3, and what happened in between them, and all those kind of things. And so it's also easy to share. You know, you put it up on your projector, and it's pretty easy for everybody to see it all at the same time.
And I know it's a little old school, but one of my biggest influences was The Far Side. And I know that he's hugely popular with scientists and mathematicians.
Absolutely.
And the whole joke about the back of a stegosaurus, the spiky things did not have a name. And in a comic, he called it the Thagomizer, named after the late Thag Simmons. And now it's literally called a Thagomizer. I think that's awesome. But there's a ton of Far Side comics just to put up on your PowerPoints, I think would be hilarious.
Yeah,
so.
Just for extras. Yeah, exactly. And they can be a really great jumping off point for a study of whatever you're moving into next. Like with my first and second graders, we were going to take a field trip to a local zoo that has rehabilitated wildlife that lives around us. So we were looking at comics about animals and graphic novels about animals, and then having the kids read something and bring up their own questions. Well, why did it do this? Or why did they say that? Or how does this work? And then we're using it as a jumping off point. If you're really into like the big 3, you know, regular comic, you go to the comic store every week and you have comics, so much science fiction shows up in those comics that can be a great jumping off point for a unit of study. So that's another thing. I would say the next level would be using them to actually teach about content, right? So you might be looking at something more like a full graphic novel or a longer form comic if you want to teach something. And there are so many of them out there in every branch of science.
There are memoir comics about Stephen Hawking. The Human Body Theater by Maris Wicks is one of my favorites. I've met Maris and it's amazing, but it's a great way to break down. And that one's definitely aimed at kids about the the respiratory system and all that kind of stuff. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's great because what it is it's a skeleton. And he's dancing on a stage, and he's like putting on and off these different parts of the body like a costume. It's hilarious. Yeah. No, she's great.
I love that one. And there's a whole series called Science Comics. It talks about all sorts of different, the whole line of them.
That there are, I think, 18 at this point, and they're going to be making more. And those are, they're not an easy read. They are pretty complex and they go pretty deeply into whatever subject they're about. There's one about robots and drones. There's one about cats. There's one about dinosaurs. There's one about volcanoes. I mean, they're just everything. I have had kids, young kids, like I had a pair of first grade twins who were really into cats, and I handed them the science comic graphic novel for cats. They were not great readers. They were only in first grade. They devoured that book.
Well, I think that's the other thing. Different levels of kids get different things out of it, but even the youngest kid can get something out of it simply because of the visual medium. So yeah, it's awesome. Speaking of that, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but one of the, I think, having kids make their own comics. Now, as a comics person myself, as a writer, you have to learn about how to structure a story. What are the characters saying? You have to really know your subject, and you have to figure out in your head, what camera angle am I going to show this from? So, I mean, it's a ton of stuff is going on. So especially in science, I would think that it'd be a very powerful thing.
It absolutely is. I think one of the best ways to have a learner or a student show you that they know a concept and they understand how it works is to make a comic about it. Because they have to think about the visuals, they have to think about the text that they're going to use, whether it's a character speaking in a speech bubble or a caption that's explaining something. And it's applicable to any level. So even my kindergartners can do it. They can draw a comic and they can show me that they understand how something works just by showing the first, the middle, and the end, which is another thing that we teach them in literacy.
Right.
Yeah, and again, we go back to the idea that you don't have to be really great at drawing things realistically. You can do it in whatever way works for you. And I think it's accessible, which is excellent, and B, it can be as complex as the learner can make it.
I've taught a few classes at schools, and I always have examples in a PowerPoint of showing from like XKCD all the way up through like a Renaissance artist, and realize that there's so much. Don't think about it in terms of the Renaissance artist. Think about it somewhere in here. Find your own style. Just a couple of squiggles is enough, So definitely making them funny. And we talk about several times already on this podcast is talking about integrating science with other disciplines, so working with your English teacher, working with the history teacher, things like that. And what a great way to do that as well. I think comics spans all of those things. You can bring in the English literature and have them working with the science teacher on a comic. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and as part of the new science standards, the new standards in general, we're supposed to be doing more reading instruction in the content areas. So, in science and in history, comics are a great way to do that because they level the playing field a bit between the kids that can read at a really high level and the kids who maybe aren't there yet. This is a way that everyone can participate. And I always like to say that in comics, even someone who doesn't read at a very high text level can make meaning out of what's on that page. And it's a great equalizer, which I love as well.
I was going to say, if you happen to be a history teacher, look for Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales.
Yes.
One of my favorite things. I love him. He's such a great
he is great
writer, and such a nice guy too. His name's actually Nathan Hale too. I think
it really is. Yeah.
So in terms of like online, I'm going to point them to your website as a starting point. I know that you're going to be doing some updating, but there's a great series of PDFs on there. You have it by content area and all that kind of stuff. So it's a great place to start. You can go to tracyedmunds.com/resources or look for the resources tab, and there's several PDFs based on content by author.
Yeah.
And there's a whole section on science, a great place to get started in doing this. And I know that there are several other books out there. My friend Tim Smith wrote a book called Teaching with Comics and Graphic Novels. That's up for an Eisner Award this year.
Yep.
Worth 1,000 Words by Merrill Jaffe and Talia Hurwitch.
Excellent
I mean, there's a lot of great sort of academic, real, basis on how to do this.
I would also recommend Hacking Graphic Novels by Shveta Miller. Excellent book. But yeah, I will definitely be updating my list because as I was preparing for this, I'm realizing that, I hadn't done it in a while and there are so many more books. They're just coming out left, right, and center all the time. So I will update and put on a specific science list by age level on there for you.
Yeah. I mean, I've been doing the podcast for over 12, 13 years, and it really has exploded. I mean, graphic novels. I mean, I come from originally sort of a wannabe newspaper cartoonist thing, but all of them have really moved into the graphic novel world because, first of all, that's where there are no more newspapers. But, but at the second place, it gives them more freedom and exploration. I mean, I remember Terry Liebenson saying, I think I'm going to write a graphic novel, and now she's got 7 in this, amazing Emmy universe. And it's just, it's an incredibly growing field and changing all the time. But again, I do think there's a ton of STEM and science stuff out there that you can bring to your classroom that I think would really, really help. Yeah,
and a lot of it, there are definitely published books that you can buy or you can order for your classroom, and there are lots and lots and lots of those. Starting at a very young level, Remy Lai created a series called Surviving the Wild. So far, we have Star the Elephant, Rainbow the Koala, and Sunny the Shark, and these are made for very young readers. They also appeal to older readers. And they are environmental stories about animals, anthropomorphized young animal characters, and the threats that they're facing and how the people can help them. I think those are fantastic books for very young readers. If you want to get into some of the older, the other one, and sometimes we talk about science, we forget to talk about technology and engineering. So there's a series called Secret Coders by Jean Yang and Mike Holm. I think there's at least 3 books in that series, which teaches kids coding in comics. It's fantastic. So that's another great one. When you're talking about older readers, there's anything by a guy named Jim Ottaviani. He's a writer. I call him the king of comics, of science comics. He works with artists and other collaborators and does a lot of mostly biographies of scientists. His new one, I believe, is about Stephen Hawking. He has one about Feynman. He has a lot of other things. They're really great. Jay Hostler is another. He's a biologist, and I think I spoke about him earlier. He did that study. He just put out a book called Santiago about Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who is a neuroscientist. Great biography, and he has books like Clan Apis and the Sandwalk Diaries, which are biology-based books. If you're looking for free comics, Maki Naro, MAKINARO, go to his website. All of his comics are available for free. They're all short form, science-based, fantastic work, especially on current topics. I would highly recommend you looking there.
That's great.
Anything by Maris Wicks, as you mentioned. She's done a number of books that are really great. Rosemary Moscow also offers free online comics. She has a site called Bird and Moon, and she has another one called Climate Comic. And those are both free online for you to use. Those are great. And another one is Beatrice the Biologist. Her name is actually Katie, but she writes under Beatrice the Biologist, and she has some online as well. You were talking a little bit about where the humanities, and the sciences come together. Marguerite de Heer, who is a cartoonist from a Scandinavian country. I can't remember which right now. I worked with her a little bit when we were working on a project that never came to fruition, but she went through and made her part. She made a comic about the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development, and that is available for free on her website. It's a fantastic piece that's available to everyone. So, I could go on and on. We've got the old school stuff like Larry Gonick's cartoon guides too, and he has different subjects in math and science. Those are still used in classrooms all over. They've been around for a while.
I have his 2-volume universe one, and I learned a ton.
Exactly.
Those are great. Yeah.
They are, and there's a whole other series called the Manga Guide too, written by different creators. That is, we know how into manga kids are. Like, it's huge.
Yeah. If you've got a kid who's into manga, that's just a great way to hand it to him. There's another one that does full Shakespeare ones that's unabridged. The full Shakespeare text from Udon Press, I think, and they're amazing. So, but I know there's some science ones as well. I think the other thing to point out is, I don't want to pick on any one particular publisher, but most of the publishers seem to have something on their websites about teaching graphic novels. Now, of course, they're going to push their own stuff, but there's often curriculum guides and all that kind of stuff totally for free based on their stuff. So I would definitely look into that. I know Scholastic has them. I know Abrams does. I received a book from Abrams. One's coming out. Oliver's Great Big Universe is coming out, and it's by Jorge Cham, who's done a couple of other ones. And so it's definitely a market that they're looking for. So each of the publishers probably has curriculum guides and free PDFs and things to download as well.
I've written a lot of those, so those do definitely exist. So when you have a book that you like, go to the publisher's website and see what they offer. That's definitely one place to look.
And also reading with pictures we talked about earlier, and I'm sure there's resources there. So there's a ton of free resources for teachers, and I think it's great, as you said, to start off with that kind of thing, of just slowly working them in, and then move on to other stuff. And I think they're great. They're jumping off points, like you said. They're a great way to teach diversity and different memoirs from different people around the world, and learning about that stuff. It's fantastic. It's a wonderful resource, and I think kids really gravitate to it. I can't emphasize that enough. So
and that's really, honestly, number one for me, and always will be, is they love them. Kids love them. They want to read them. You hand them a science textbook, they're going to groan, no matter how good it is. But if you hand them a comic, they're going to be like, what's this, right? And I had a second grader who was highly gifted and really into science, particularly into chemistry. And every time we had a conversation, he would tell us what the chemical makeup was of whatever we were talking about, whatever. I handed him the science comic graphic novel about the periodic table of elements. he wouldn't look up for hours. He just couldn't get enough of it. And then he had to show everybody all the pages, and he had to, so it's just,
That's awesome.
they're very engaging for kids. And that's always for me going to be the number one reason to use them, on top of all the other pedagogical reasons that are so great.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like an iceberg. I think the tip of it is like, this is cool. And then the rest of it is just amazing education. So
Exactly.
Tracy, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, I've had
You're
you
welcome.
on several panels, and I always learn something. It's always exciting to
thanks.
talk to you about this. And it's a subject that I can't be more passionate about. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Can I plug something real quick?
Always plug.
All right. So DC Comics put out a book called Flash Facts, which is an anthology of comics specifically created about science for kids. It's fantastic.
Cecil Castellucci, right?
She's in there. Yep. There's a lot of really great people in there. And I was the science advisor, or an educational advisor for that. And Matt and Shari Brady were the science advisors. So yeah, that's a really great book. Pick it up. The other thing I've done recently is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Epic. Epic is an online digital library where kids can go and read books for free during the school day. Mm-hmm. They have been putting out their own original content. They have a character called Master Hamster, who is a supervillain. And I have been advising them on a new series called Master Hamster Super Science, which is hilarious and teaches kids about different content in science. So read it, please.
Excellent. And if kids want to become a supervillain, they've got to learn science. That's important.
Exactly.
Stuff, so
Exactly.
All right, Tracy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Now it's time to head out to the gloriously nerdy and exciting world-famous San Diego Comic-Con. I've been attending this con for 15 years now, interviewing dozens and dozens of authors, artists, celebrities, and cosplayers. I have seen both big-time publishers and independent presses ride the huge wave of graphic novels that have exploded in popularity. And I'm very excited to bring you some interviews with comics creators who love science education and can help you with resources, tips, and books to get your kids just as excited about science as we are. San Diego Comic-Con 2023. I'm here with Corinna Bechko. Rhymes with gecko.
That's right.
And there's a reason for that, because we're talking to the dinosaur lady. I don't know if that's your official term, but that's how I'm referring to
I will take that. I like that.
We saw a panel with you, and it was really, really amazing, and then found out that you work at the LA County Natural History Museum. And we're like, we have to talk to you about stuff, about science education. So again, our podcast is aimed pretty much at K through 12 educators. Let's start off with the big question we always ask. Why is science education important for kids?
I think that it's really important for a couple of reasons. The main one is I loved it when I was a kid. Yeah. And so I want to share that with other people, because that was where I got started by doing things that were looking at science. My parents encouraged me, and it's just a really good way to spark wonder about the world, even if you don't go into science.
Excellent. I love it. And we have a lot of talks about people just take your kids outside. Look at the sky. What's the cloud doing today? Look at the moon. There's so much you can just do just by going outside.
Absolutely.
So talk to me about what you do specifically for the museum.
I am a fossil preparator, which means that I go out on digs in the summer. Like I'm leaving in a couple of days to go to Utah to look for dinosaurs.
Excellent.
We dig up dinosaur bones, take them back to the lab, and in the lab we very carefully prepare them. Sometimes they're mounted, sometimes they're used for research.
Okay, and at the museum you do talks with students, and you have students come in. What is that like? I mean, it seems universal for children. I have 2 kids, and I don't care who you are, kids love dinosaurs. I don't know what it is. I don't know why. Why do you think it is? Why do you think it is?
I think it's because they are monsters that are real, but that still can't hurt you.
That is the best explanation I've ever heard. I love that. You see the big bones, but they've been dead a long time.
Exactly. Exactly.
So when the kids come in, what do you do with them?
Often I bring them through, I work in a lab. Sometimes I work in a lab that is accessible to the public, so they can watch me work through like a glass. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I work in a lab where it's behind the scenes, but we bring kids through there too. Over the course of the pandemic, I did a lot of classrooms that couldn't even come to LA. It was pretty cool, like some up in the Bay Area, different areas, and I'd show them on my phone through Zoom and do a little demonstrations for them. That's and great. Tell them about dinosaurs.
I keep hoping that that's one good thing to have come out of the pandemic, that people realize that you can do these things, that we were forced to do them, but they open up so many doors. I mean, you could be doing this with somebody in England, You know, I mean,
Absolutely,
I love
and
that
we
kind of thing.
do that. We've actually done some that are remote. I didn't personally do this one, but someone on my team did one with some schools in Indonesia.
Oh, that's awesome.
So cool, yeah.
That's awesome. What do the kids generally ask? What are the kind of questions for you?
They always ask me, what's the biggest dinosaur I've ever found?
And the answer is?
It was a sauropod I worked on, and one of the vertebrate blocks that I had to prepare, we had to do a test on the load-bearing walls of the museum.
How do they move those things around? I mean, obviously very carefully is the first step,
Yes,
but you have to
yes.
box them up in Utah and then bring them down. That must be a whole thing in and of itself.
Right, it is. They because bones like that, they are stone, but they're fragile. So we put plaster casts around them, just like they used to do back in the 1800s. And in this case, we rented a U-Haul trailer and we brought it back, and then we had to bring it up in the elevator very carefully. We had to take all the doors off of everything in the way, move everything, and it's going to go up on display, though. It's going to be the world's only green dinosaur on display, because these bones are, because of the minerals in them, they are green, and I think kids are going to love that.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a great selling point right there. It's the
Yeah.
Incredible Hulk of dinosaurs.
Exactly,
I love that.
exactly.
So speaking to teachers in general, now teachers do a lot of field trips and things like that. How would a teacher, like if they really, really wanted to show their kids their stuff, how do they approach museums in general? Like, I mean, you can talk about your museum, but I mean, who do they reach out to and what kind of programs do you offer?
You know, we have a ton of, we had started to have a lot of programs before the pandemic. I put it on hold, and we're really coming back now. So we have something called Adventures in Nature during the summer, where kids come in. But during the school year, we really encourage kids to, teachers to bring their classrooms. So they reach out to events, and we have somebody now on staff that is the point person for that. But anybody at the museum can put them in contact. I imagine a lot of museums are like that, because we really want to encourage the community to get involved.
Right.
We have now a lot of community science-based programs, like not just about dinosaurs, about counting bats in your community. We have one where you can watch birds for just 10 minutes a week, called Project Phoenix, that just started.
So actually gathering data for...
Gathering data, and it
That's
doesn't have
awesome.
to be at the museum. Kids can do it in their yard.
That's
If they
awesome.
even if they don't have a bird feeder, just go out 10 minutes. There's a special way to do it, and then they can be part of this collecting data and actually part of something that's going to be published.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's exactly the kind of stuff. I know NASA has a lot of those things where they
Yes,
release the
I
photos
love
the
what
same
NASA's
day,
doing.
and so everybody can look at them and maybe weigh in on things. And
Right.
What a great way to get kids involved.
Oh, it's
And that's
terrific.
awesome.
And I mean, adults can do it too, and whole classrooms, I understand, have been encouraged to do this.
That's awesome. Teacher could really embrace something like that. Look, every week we go out and look for something. Or,
Absolutely.
that is wonderful. Here we are at Comic-Con, and I know there's probably, if there's one subject in science that has a lot of books about, it's going to be dinosaurs. But do you have any specific books or graphic novels, maybe at a very young age and maybe slightly older age? Anything you would recommend?
Gosh, actually, I co-wrote a book called Smithsonian Dig It Dinosaurs. I'm
There
going to
you go.
do a self-plug here. I wrote it with Brenda Scott Royce.
That's great.
It came out a couple years ago, and it is for like younger middle grade, and it comes with a little block. You can dig out your own little dinosaur bone.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's really fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise, science books, gosh, there are anything that you can find. I feel anything that you read or find that sparks that wonder and makes you want to know more, even if it's totally fictional and crazy and couldn't happen. I mean, then you can still have conversations with your kids, or your kids can have conversations with other grown-ups in their lives about, could this happen? Why not? Why? I love to talk like that when I do outreach. A lot of times people come to me and say they hate Jurassic Park, or do I hate Jurassic Park because it's so incorrect? No, I love it, because then it gives you something to talk about.
That's awesome. Yeah. I can't get too angry at Hollywood in general. I mean, there's things you can pick at when they really get something wrong. But in general, yeah, that movie probably sparked a generation of people who wanted to learn more about dinosaurs. so-
Absolutely. We get interns in all the time in the museum, and they came in because of the Jurassic
Right.
Park franchise.
I think the people who are really interested know that it was a movie, but it sparked them to go down that route. They're not
Right.
thinking it was history. They're thinking it was like, this is awesome.
And
they
if
go
it
down
makes
there,
them
yeah.
want to learn more, that's the important thing. I think the important thing is not the facts, it's the wanting to learn more. I write graphic novels too, that's my other job, and I write fiction, but I hope that people want to know, is this fact or fiction?
Right. And that's the other thing is I often, as an artist, I often approach it from that when I was a kid, dinosaur is awesome. I mean, I get to draw the dinosaurs, work on the bones, that kind of thing. That's how you could reach that kind of a kid, a visual learner, because so much of what you do is visual.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
was it a meat eater? Was it not? That kind of a thing.
Yeah, what can we learn about the teeth? Why is it set up like that? Yeah.
And how much has changed since I was a kid? I mean, I always joke about, like, my favorite dinosaur was the Brontosaurus, which doesn't exist.
It's funny. A lot of people also, I feel like, they're like, oh, I don't want to know until I know for sure. And the thing that's cool about science is you never know for sure. So you can always learn more.
Right.
And I think that's the fun part, because there's always a mystery to solve.
Yeah, I know. That always seems to be the key for me, is that people think there has to be a definitive answer. And science is always like, yeah, but it could change because we find new information.
I mean, who wants to be? It would be boring if we knew everything, right?
Do you have a particular find that was your favorite? Maybe not your biggest, but was something that you found that you were like, oh my God, I've been looking for this, or no one's found this, or whatever?
Yes, I didn't find it, but my boss went to Antarctica.
Oh, wow.
And he brought back this creature called a Thrinaxodon. And it's a early Triassic, not quite a reptile, not quite a mammal. It probably had scales, and it probably had whiskers. And this creature was found in its burrow. It had died in its burrow, but some of them are found with small ones with them. We know they did parental care. Huh. So I tell kids it's a kitty dinosaur, or a kitty dragon.
There you
go. It really looks like it could be a kitty dragon.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah. Every time I think of anything coming out of Antarctica, I immediately think of the movie The Thing. So it might not be a good thing. You gotta leave that under the ground. I don't know what's going on.
Maybe don't poke it too much, but interesting to learn about.
I want to wrap up with, you're a museum person. When you take students to a museum, what are the kind of things you would want teachers to point out to kids to get them to spark their interest, the leading questions to like figuring things out?
I find when I'm doing outreach at the museum, it's whatever the kids are interested in. And sometimes a group of kids will be really into, say, Pokemon. And it's if you can relate something to what they're interested in and get them thinking about that, I find it leads to really interesting questions I wouldn't have thought to ask. And then I'm like, well, let me go find that out.
Yeah.
That's my favorite part.
When a kid stumps the scientist, that's awesome.
Yes, I love that.
Exactly. Corinna, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
San Diego Comic-Con 2023 continues, and I'm here with Brandon Easton, who we saw a great panel with, talking about science and STEM things, and you introduced yourself when you were up there. We just sat there looking, and David and I said, we're talking to him, because you are a former teacher, you are a writer for many amazing places like Star Trek and all sorts of stuff. So tell me a little bit about what you do and your background.
All right, so in terms of like what I've been working on in the last few years, I was show running a series for a streamer that I can't talk about because of the strike, other than which was a fantastic experience otherwise. But I've been doing a lot of comic book stuff. Last few shows I worked on would have been like Transformers War for Cybertron on Netflix. I did Marvel's Agent Carter.
Oh, wow.
Many years ago.
Great show.
My first big gig was the Thundercats reboot of 2011. And then I did a ton of comic book stuff, pro wrestling comics, did Marvel stuff, lots of DC stuff recently. And the last couple of big things I worked on was Kamen Rider 01 for Titan, as well as the new Robotech series, Robotech Rick Hunter, which we actually had an exclusive for here at the show.
That's right, you were signing down there.
Yeah, I was signing early, yeah. So, I mean...
Like all your childhood dreams coming true.
Pretty much. And the crazy thing about it is I also do, volunteer work for NASA, the Solar System Ambassadors Program, SSA. And I was a New York City public school teacher for about 6 years.
Wow.
I taught history and economics, so that was pretty cool. And then, I moved out to LA around 2008 to pursue my screenwriting dreams, and things pretty much have been going, forward since then.
Very well. That's awesome. I'm from New York, by the way. Let's hear it for New York Public Schools. Awesome. That's awesome. So, our podcast is aimed at science educators, and your panel was so great about planetary science and all that kind of stuff. You're a NASA outreach person. In general, we love to first focus on why is science important for kids to learn?
I mean, I can think about, I always use myself as an example. Like when I was a kid, I watched a lot of PBS, and there was a very popular show called 3-2-1 Contact, and it was made by the Children's Television Workshop. And it was a science-based show that was extremely practical and highly intelligent. Also, I grew up watching Reading Rainbow with LeVar Burton, And I just kind of feel that having an understanding of the most basic scientific principles helps you to decode the world around you. Like, why does a rock and a penny fall at the same rate? Why does it rain? Why does it get cloudy? Why is it windy? What is the sun? All these basic things. I mean, children are insatiably curious, and it takes a lot for a kid to stop caring about the world and stop asking questions. And science is kind of like the first way you learn how to ask questions. I mean, obviously, there's a scientific method. So once you have that as like part of just your basic personality, I feel like it equips you with an understanding of the world, or a desire to understand the world that you wouldn't have without the scientific method.
One thing you were talking about on the panel was, we're kind of living in a golden age of getting all this amazing information.
Absolutely.
The new web, the telescopes, and just showing us things in detail that we never imagined.
Yeah.
And so that kind of thing. Why is like space science? Why do you think, what is important about that for kids to learn for the future? And is it important to be thinking about terraforming Mars or using that information to help us on Earth?
I think the first thing space science does for anybody, child or adult, is give them a sense of perspective. There's 1,000,001 videos online where it zooms out from Earth and it shows you solar system, then the Oort cloud, and then the Orion Arm, I think it is, and then our local group, and then the supercluster, and you keep going further and further out. You cannot have an ego with an understanding of how infinitesimal we are in this universe. In the grand scheme, we are absolutely nothing. And that's not a bad thing, right? So I kind of look at it from the perspective that it gives people an understanding of how the world actually works. I mean, I said this on the panel too, that, we have flat earthers.
Right.
And I'm like, if there was ever a failure of a public education system, it's the fact that we have people who actually believe. I mean, it is incredibly stupid, but people really believe that the earth is flat. There are people who actually believe that. And that has given me a lot of sleepless nights, And
I remember hearing that for just, I don't know, a year or two ago, whatever, and I went, wait, what? Is that, are we kidding? Is this an Onion article? No, it's
I thought
not.
people were joking.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about it, they put this to bed 2,000 or 2,500 years ago without even going into space.
Yeah.
So
guy with some sticks and shadows figured it out, man.
I mean, the Egyptian pyramids give you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
It lines up with Orion, the belt of Orion. But, it's just utterly important to understand the framework of reality. I mean, not everyone's going to understand molecules and physics and quantum mechanics and all that. But if you just understand that the Earth is part of a planetary system that's moving through space, that space and time are interconnected, and things of that nature, you're able to enjoy and understand more, particularly understand the science fiction.
Right.
I mean, it really helps if you understand, if you know a little bit about NASA, if you go see the movie Interstellar.
Right.
It helps you understand what the hell's going on in the film.
Right.
And I feel that the more people understand about space science, I feel like the more they understand about themselves and the world they live in my opinion.
You do some NASA outreach. What can teachers, if they want out that, a lot of that stuff is totally free, it's online.
Yeah,
what do you suggest for a teacher who are like, wow, my kids are really interested in this? What kind of NASA things do you suggest, or what kind of things are there for teachers to do?
Well, if you go to nasa.gov, they have an educational tab, you can click on it, and there's I want to say maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources on the NASA website, specifically tailored for educators with rubrics and with national or local standards.
Oh, wow. There you go.
So that's the first thing you can do. And again, I will reiterate, it is 100% free.
Right.
Then you have the Solar System Ambassadors Program, which is also 100% free, where you get someone like myself to come into a library, a classroom, a community center, a park, to do, for example, the last time they had the solar eclipse, the SSA program went out. Well, I was part of a group that went out to Monrovia in California, smaller community, what we call a LA suburb city, and we went out there, and it was absolutely wonderful because we had a library classroom filled with not only children but their parents, and a great many of those families were from South or Central America, who did not necessarily grow up with those type of resources. So the fact that not only the children were getting exposed to it, but their parents were exposed and interested. And there's nothing better than having a family together learning. I
Right,
mean, I can't think of a better thing in the world.
It's such a great environment for a kid when they know the family wants to learn too. I
Right.
think if it's important to them,
And the
it'll
root
become
of all
important
of
to
it,
the kids.
yeah, absolutely. And the root of all of it is, again, free.
Right. It's
You know,
amazing.
it doesn't cost a single dime.
We are here at Comic-Con, Nerd Central,
Absolutely. This is
Nerd
great.
Parade. This is the best thing in the world. And one of the most obvious conversations about science it deals with Star Trek and how it inspired generations. I mean, literally 3 seasons, 79 episodes, and yet look at the legacy it's left.
Amazing.
So amazing.
Yeah.
And as one of the things that I always want to point out is how important, especially I've told my kids, is how important it was as an inspiration that would led to things like the iPad and the phone and all that kind of stuff. All these kids wanted to become engineers. But also, I think on a social level there was a black woman, an Asian guy, a Russian guy right in the middle of the Cold War. You know? And it just was like, that's the way it is. Okay, we're just moving on. And it was so wonderful. But how, since you've worked with Star Trek and you write for Star Trek, how can a teacher maybe use that, get kids excited about using science fiction and pop culture into their science classrooms?
Okay, so Star Trek is tricky because kids today, unless you're talking about like Lower Decks or the Prodigy series, you have to use Star Trek and meet them where they are. You know, we may have grown up differently where we watched the old ones on like black and white TVs, on UHF channels.
Oh, yeah.
Because we didn't really have too much else.
Right.
There were like 3 channels and maybe a UHF 1 and UHF 2. Yeah. That's all we got. We didn't have cable. So in a lot of ways, it's going to sound ridiculous, I was kind of forced to watch Star Trek because there wasn't really a whole lot of science fiction alternatives.
Right.
Now kids have everything in the universe plus a basket of potato chips to watch. Star Trek, like they have younger audience versions of Star Trek, obviously. But I think other science fiction properties, like the Star Wars, even because Star Wars tends to like hit a younger audience anyway. I think teachers, and I did see this is a mistake teachers made. A lot of teachers don't even know pop culture themselves.
No.
A lot of teachers live in a bubble, especially in academia in general. People live in bubbles, so they're not sitting around thinking about ways to use pop culture in a classroom. I used Indiana Jones for history stuff. I used Iron Man, the first film, when I was teaching, about economics and politics and the military industrial complex, which is really the core of who Tony Stark is.
Right.
And always has been.
Yeah.
I think it's utterly important because kids believe what they see, not what they hear. People believe what they see and not what they hear. So if you can find a way to show them, for example, like what space looks like a movie like Interstellar, which is way above most kids' heads, but there's certain scenes that you can get them with. Like when they're on Miller's Planet and you have the giant tidal waves. Oh, why would those tidal waves be the size of Mount Everest? Oh, because the planet is next to a black hole and it's pulling. Right. So that can give a great example of how the moon affects our waves and our tides and things like that. I mean, there's all these tricks you could use. So I don't know if it's necessarily series-based, but I think situationally, you can use scenes from all kinds of science fiction films to engage them and also teach a scientific principle.
Right.
Star Trek is tricky because a lot of Star Trek is and always have morality plays, which kids can't sit through. Yeah. I love the risk is our business speech, but most kids don't know what that means.
Yeah.
They don't understand what Kirk was really saying because they weren't there. Star Trek launched before we got to the moon.
Yeah.
So risk is our business might mean nothing to a kid nowadays. So I think about it in like situational scenes and clips that kids could use and engage with.
I was going to wrap up with what is one of your, you go to schools, you talk to kids about NASA stuff. What is one of your favorite things to teach kids about NASA, or like a moment that kind of blows their mind?
Oh, well, what I usually do is my presentation is the myths of spaceflight according to Hollywood. So what I do is I show them scenes from very popular science fiction movies and TV shows, and I stop the scene and I say, what in there was real and what in there was made up? And that gets them every single time. Yeah. Because we're getting to watch stuff that they, really cool action scenes in space. Yeah. But then a lot of it is about like how do ships move? Right. Babylon 5, I felt like was a really good example of how ships actually move in space because they did retro thrusters, like things just didn't turn on a dime. And if they did, it's because they fired rockets in the opposite direction, slowed down, and then flipped. Stuff like that. I showed them the Death Star attack run from the original Star Wars. And I said, what's wrong with this whole scene? spaceships, like little spaceships like that would not move like airplanes do on Earth.
Right. No banking.
Yeah, I mean, especially all of it doesn't move like that,
Right.
you know? So it's stuff like that they really get into. So I usually start them on the path of like, next time you see a space scene or anything space oriented, ask yourself, is this scientifically accurate?
Right.
And we go from there.
That's awesome. Great way to spring to it. Brandon, this has been great. And I
you so
want to
much.
talk to you so much more about a million things. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We're at Comic-Con 2023, and we are talking to Laini Taylor and Jim DiBartolo, husband and wife team.
Yes.
Laini is an American young adult fantasy author, finalist for the National Book Award in Young People's Literature, best known for Daughter of Smoke and Bone series and Strange the Dreamer. Jim is a mixed media illustrator, painter, visual storyteller. You've done comics and novels and role-playing games, and now you've also worked on one other book together, right? Lips Touch 3 times?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we did. We did that book, and we also did.
Jim did,
I illustrated parts of.
My first books, Jim did character art and covers for, and then we also collaborated on a novella that was a Daughter of Smoke and Bone tie-in.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I was going to comment, do you guys have the best book titles? The Daughter of Smoke and Bone. I mean, my God, that's awesome. But we're actually here to talk about your new one, Billy Blaster and the Robot Army from Outer Space, which also continues your amazing title run.
Thank you.
What kid would not want to read that? That's
Right?
what's so cool
Well, we're
about that.
hoping.
That is awesome. So really what we want to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about your work, and then we want to talk, our podcast is aimed at teachers of science, so K through 12 basically, and we're trying to basically evangelize science for them and give them tips and things to do. And now
Terrific.
my personal evangelism is I've been at Comic-Con for years, and I've moderated a ton of panels on using comics in the classroom and how important that is and how it works for kids and all. And now, so I'm focusing on the science stuff.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about your work in general. Your work, a lot of your stuff seems to be in the fantasy genre, but Billy's definitely in the sci-fi. What is your
Yes.
background sort of with science and sci-fi growing up?
I don't have a science background except insofar as that I had bad science teachers in school, and it really put me off. I think a path that I don't think I would have become a scientist, but I've always been so fascinated with it. And my younger sister, is a scientist. She's a herpetologist and a professor of biology. And
Wow.
she teaches endocrinology and she teaches herpetology. And she went to different schools than me. I really saw, in retrospect, I can see where I got shut down and didn't, my interest in science kind of ended in high school with really lackluster curriculum. And
That's a whole podcast in itself, how important teaching is. I mean, a
Absolutely.
bad teacher stopped me from getting further into math. I was in advanced math all the way to
Yeah.
trigonometry, and I reached a guy who was probably obviously at the end of his boat.
Yeah.
And he was
I
like,
had
we're done.
Yeah,
And
I
I'm
mean,
like,
and
couple
that
of those,
and
yeah.
that can be case by case, but it can
Yeah.
also be like institutional.
Yeah, that too,
It can
yeah.
be an institutional problem.
Well,
But
that's one of the reasons we love talking about this
yeah.
stuff is because it's inspiring to teachers to
Yeah.
hand a kid a book that gets them excited about
Yes,
science, which is really, really
absolutely.
cool. How about Jim, as an artist? Did you have a science background? But I mean, you get to draw robots for a
Yeah.
living.
Yeah.
As a fellow artist, that's like the coolest thing. You're like the pinnacle of Mount Everest in terms of art. I get to draw robots. So,
Meet me at the top. Up there.
so what was your background in any kind of science fiction or science?
Oh, I mean, like, gosh, everything from, here being at Comic-Con, as we've been coming since 2000, 2001. And so just seeing all the things that I'm like, just to call back to my childhood. Like yesterday, I got to see a bunch of Ultraman things that were
Oh,
life-size
wow, yeah,
and whatnot.
yeah.
And then I literally chased down the street Spectre Man, who was a much lesser known, but just as cool, like of that era in late 60s, early 70s.
So a guy wearing a costume, you chase him down?
Yeah, I dressed up as him. My mom made a costume for me and when I was 9 that I was like, I want to be Spectre Man for Halloween. She helped me, and she mostly did the work, I'm sure. But anyway, so yeah, all that stuff from like early comics, to those like Ultraman, Ultron, early Transformers cartoons, all that kind of stuff that really sparked my imagination as a child for sci-fi. And I know Laini had was like into like Flash Gordon and
we met Flash Gordon today.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very cool. He still looks like he could like smash somebody. And but yeah,
As a writer, Laini, can you talk about the importance of science education in general? I mean, I think that, obviously as a writer, it's about life experience, right? It's about taking everything in. So, I mean, a teacher would want to reach every kid they can. So as a writer, how do you feel that you can reach kids with education in science?
Well, and I want to say too, even though I'm primarily a fantasy writer, my two biggest sources of inspiration are history and science. And if you're whether you're writing a fantasy creature villain or I'm endlessly going back to mostly biology, but a lot of other areas of science for details that I can then twist into fantasy. But I mean, it's like really, there's nothing weirder or cooler than you can use as source material than the reality of this world, the truth of the creatures on this world.
And I was going to ask, actually, because a lot of your rooting is in fantasy, but when you write a science fiction book, did you feel more beholden to looking into what robot science might be and actual science? Maybe I can't twist this as much?
Well, in this case, no, because Billy Blaster is not science fiction in the let's do real science sense. It's just pure fun, and so it doesn't accurately reflect. But it's really about.
It is not meant as a documentary, people.
Right. It's really about just the excitement of creation of what you can make with science, and what you can but maybe shouldn't make also.
Well, that part though I think is really interesting. I think a science teacher could work on that because it's a robot that makes robots that then went off and made a whole bunch of robots, which is the problem.
Right.
So that's a moral issue, right? I mean, that's a question you say, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that, or
I mean, as Jim framed it as just because you can,
the Jurassic Park thing, right?
Doesn't mean you should.
And in the panel we were just off of, we were talking about, I think Laini brought it up, the current issue of AI.
Right.
And
Very topical.
the whole, and like she was saying, we've talked about it amongst ourselves and friends and whatnot, just because there's this technology that allows you to type in a prompt and spit out whatever visually or in words.
And it's going to make some billionaires a lot of money.
And that's the problem.
and compete with jobs for people that have been training and are in debt for school and or have given up other avenues of their careers because that's their passion. Right. You're competing against somebody who can just type words into a prompt.
But it's soulless. And
that's competing against your job at a fraction of the cost to a publisher or to a studio.
And you were talking about just the joy of creation.
Yeah, there's truly I've been drawing since I was as long as I can remember. I started drawing when I saw my dad's drawings from when he was a kid, and he didn't pursue that even though he was super talented. And even just last night, I'm 53. I'm in the hotel room, the three of us, our daughter's with us. She's 13, and she's runaway, loves drawing, loves all kinds of art. And we're all sitting there creating in the hotel room late at night. And I still, at my age, kept flipping back to the drawing I had done a minute ago in my sketchput because there's nothing like that thrill of creation. I know Laini gets that too with writing.
The satisfaction of I made that.
Yeah.
And you don't get that from having put a prompt into a.
And it's a really interesting issue because I'm a film editor and I'm a voiceover guy, and AI is going to affect each of those things differently. Some of it's great. As a film editor, it cuts masks and people out of things that are oh my God, that's going to save me hours. And some of it is terrifying.
If there was a way to make sure it was only used to save time, that
regulation.
Yeah, really.
Right. And not to destroy all the creative jobs. And
it's really interesting how fast it's happening. A lot of these changes are slow over years. This is we need to deal with this right now, thanks.
Yes,
it's really interesting in that
sense.
So
so that's one of the things in Billy. It's how this is about scientific responsibility, but in a very fun, young, age-appropriate way of looking at, for example, the main character and her nemesis it's not outwardly mentioned, but she's wearing a T-shirt that says "Science is cool," and he's wearing a T-shirt that says "Science is important," and it's as if there's okay, it's both, but they have different perspectives, and actually one of them is making important science, and the other one's making fun, cool science,
right?
And there's a problem, but science also solves the problems that are created.
Yeah. I also love that it's a female character. Now, I know that we've made great strides, and we've already interviewed several scientists who are very top of their field, who are women, but it's a wonderful thing, I think, for girls to read this book and say, hey, I can go down a science book, because I still think do you agree? Do you think girls still face that sort of oh, you want to do science, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't on the science, but I heard something in the signing line today that I hadn't heard in a while. And
it was
oh my
really
God,
surprising.
are we still there? And it was a woman who said, oh, I would get that book except my son doesn't read girl characters. And so that's kind of not exactly the same topic.
But then we were like, but there's robots and there's aliens.
I know, really.
And there's
there
are male characters.
It's what would classically be considered a boy book, except it has a female main character. And like we like to think that just because we resolved these issues years ago that they've been resolved.
But they're
no.
not. Right. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I have to keep remembering that. It comes back and I'm like, damn it, I thought we were past that. But
So yeah, I mean, we know the girls in tech and girls in science and
Yeah.
women in tech and women in science are still facing massive
Absolutely.
barriers. Yeah.
I was gonna say the thing we should have said we didn't mention to her. There's also a toilet weasel in the book. Maybe that would have grabbed her.
Yeah.
some.
there you go. Yeah, more toilet weasels, fart jokes.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's play right to the boys' strength. Right
Yes.
there. That's
Right.
I'm the youngest of 6 boys. I understand all of that. That's awesome. Yeah. How about in general? I'll go to you, Jim. In terms of like what I love about graphic novels is that as they're taking more importance as time goes by, comics were dismissed when we were kids,
Oh my
right?
God, yeah.
But they made me want to read more, and they're finally coming around to that. Obviously, I think we have a whole generation of teachers now who grew up on those comics and understand the power of that,
Yeah.
and they understand the power of the combination of the written and the visual.
Yes.
Why do you think that works for kids? Why are graphic novels so important to help them learn basically anything, not only science, but anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just like how kids are receptive and such like little sponges for things like language and being able to like pick up a language a lot faster than someone our age, and the same thing with comics. They I mean, same thing with kids with graphic novels and with visual storytelling. They're able to like see the visuals mixed with the words, and sometimes those aren't necessarily telling the same story. Like comics, like cinema, can do the thing that like a novel can't, where you can be showing somebody walking down the street, but actually like narrating it differently, talking about something else that's happening, or there's an action that's happening in the comic that's maybe like gruesome, or in a movie or something, but the narrator is talking about something that's completely irrelevant to that scene, but is also important to the story. And kids, I think, have with that elastic brains and those sponge-like brains, they're able to sort of like, I don't know, they're able to, I think, paint those worlds and fill in those gaps and understand them more quickly than adults are. I know, like, our daughter, we started with picture books when she was teeny, and then pretty rapidly she wanted bigger, longer stories when she was, like, even, like, 3.5.
And this was like, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
During the we've raised a reader during the boom of graphic novels for kids,
which is great.
Yeah.
And interestingly, we actually wrote Billy Blaster 14 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
But the industry wasn't really there yet in the mainstream publishing industry. And we sort of like had uniquely, we met in art school, and I was interested in children's books and Jim was interested in comics. And so it was like through this crossover of me coming to Comic-Con with him and him coming to like children's book conferences with me that we were like, where are the kids' comics? Because 20 years ago, there were not any. There just weren't. And it seemed like here's America saying comics are for kids, but there were no comics for kids.
Yeah. And like our daughter, she was able to pretty immediately understand the graphic novels and like the words and pictures, and they don't necessarily match. And then when she started we really introduced her to manga, which are Japanese comics for those don't know, and she immediately but you read them from right to left,
right?
And so she immediately like picked those up, didn't have any problem making that adjustment, elastic brain. But they will meet adults that are parents of little kids, and like they can't get through a comic because they don't understand matching the words and which direction am I supposed to go, up and down or left or right, let alone if you hand them one and say now do it backwards. Whereas she, like when she was like 8, she was like boom boom, I can do it back and forth
kids have
between
no
comics
problem with
to
that.
manga. I don't even care. It's just like a flipping.
And they were this incredible bridge for her because in second grade she had friends who were already reading Harry Potter, but she wasn't one of those kids who was reading Harry Potter in second grade.
Yeah.
And when there are like early reader books and whatnot, but then there's also going from picture books to all text. A lot of kids aren't ready for that, and graphic novels are the perfect in between that gives them a sense of satisfaction. They've read a whole book by themselves, and they'll reread it and reread it and reread it and get like more and more out of it every time, and then on their own eventually maybe we'll be ready for all text pages. But there's no rush to get there. Exactly. And it keeps them reading.
Right.
And one thing that I know a lot of people when they read books want to also become writers, but one thing that's kind of cool about comics is you read a comic and maybe you want to write a comic, but maybe you also want to draw. Like maybe it'll just make you like feel inspired. Like I can do that. I want to tell a little story that I have in my head. And
I go off on that all the time about teachers looking for the art students, like people like I'm sure you and I were drawing in the background, not really listening. But there's a way to reach us too. If I'm designing the infographics for the science, I'm really engaged in it.
Right.
I want to know more about it now because they're approaching me as an artist.
Absolutely.
And, very important stuff.
I wanted to say one thing on the subject of, and I think as a science, in science education, that you would appreciate this if you haven't heard this quote. It's by Ray Bradbury, and he was talking about back in his day about teachers and librarians wouldn't touch it.
Looked down
And
upon,
the
yeah.
quote was, kids who had never read so much as a pirate's obituary in their lives were suddenly turning pages with their tongues and ravening for more.
And that just sums it up. I mean, it's just if it gets the kid excited, then it's good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's all
And
there
the
is
teachers
to
are
it.
like, what is happening? More of this science fiction stuff.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So basically, it's all about getting kids excited. I think
Yeah.
that's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, so incredible pleasure to meet you both. I love your work,
You
and
too.
we're this is definitely the kind of a graphic novel that I think will get boys and girls very, very excited. And I think it is the kind of thing that can lead to larger discussions about robots, about AI, that kind of thing. And teachers can use it as a jumping off point. So I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
So thank you so much for
Thank
your
you
time.
so much.
Thank you for your time. I
Yeah.
appreciate you seeking us out and making this happen. And it's been a real pleasure.
It's Time for Science is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lipman and Tom Racine, and is sponsored by School Specialty and FOSS, the Full Option Science System, at the Lawrence Hall of Science, UC Berkeley. Be sure to check out FOSS over on Facebook and Twitter.